I just can't imagine that anybody, and talking about spiritual immaturity, if anyone is actually like a comic book villain that cackles and rubs their hands together. Ha ha! I'm going to, you know,
Yeah.
commit more dastardly deeds today and get away
Mhm.
with it. It seems,
That's what I mean. That's the cartoonish version of it. I just find hard to believe, let's say I'm sitting down and I'm having a coffee with one of my mates, and maybe, well, there's a very small percentage of my mates that'll be talking about this, but the one or two that does is they've got this kind of like there's no in between, right? It's either you have this cartoon version of the Mr. Burns kind of figure from The Simpsons, rubbing his hands together, as you said, thinking of evil acts. And then you have the other side of it where it's just a big conspiracy to be laughed at. So there's no in between that kind of
no,
that
well,
of.
I mean, there is, but there's by no means enough, and it's a huge area.
Mhm.
I mean, this is a very basic thing I was aware of from very early on with somebody like David Icke, who I always cite, but just because he's easy to go to, like if you join the dots and you only have 5% of the dots, what kind of image are you going to come up with? Because there's 95% of these other dots that presumably a lot of them are come between the dots that you're joining. So you have a straight line there, but actually with all these other dots, there's nothing like a straight line. So it's back to that house analogy. You create a picture that is completely distorted. It's closer to reality than if you're not using any of the dots, or if you're only using the dots that have been provided by well, the very forces that you would be trying to expose with the dot joining, if you see what I mean. So you got the official version, which is haha conspiracy theory. That means you're a crackpot or an extremist domestic terrorist. In today's climate, they've upped the ante now. A conspiracy theorist isn't just someone to laugh at. He or she is somebody to fear. Um, but of course, I say of course, perhaps you're aware that the very term conspiracy theory was seeded by the CIA. I feel like I have to put it in quotes because it was probably more complex than that, but it can be traced, documented. There are documented evidence that the CIA were directly involved in seeding that term and making it associated with things, narratives they wanted to marginalize.
Jason, I'm pleased to be able to speak to you. And as I was saying to you earlier on, I was listening, I was reading over your Substack post yesterday, and you mentioned something at the end of the Substack post about the Sabbatians. And I was wondering if you want to get into that. It's, as I was saying to you, I've read numerous articles. I've listened to different YouTube videos, of course, and listened to different various theories on the nature of the world and how the world works. And when I was reading about the Sabbatians, I think that's how you pronounce it, but on Sabbatians, it kind of put everything into a kind of it fitted everything into a jigsaw for me, anyways. How do you see that?
In what way did it put the pieces together for you?
For example, when you hear people say, for example, the Rothschilds, and that they're Satanists, and that they are part of this global conspiracy to enslave us, it kind of seems almost simplistic. It kind of seems almost that it's kind of like a rabbit hole that you go down through, and it almost seems unbelievable. However, when what I was reading or what I was looking up about the Sabbatians, it's like these guys they actually have a beginning. I think it was to do with this Sabati Asi, whatever you call.
Zvi, yeah, sabotage Zvi, yeah.
Yeah, and how he started this almost this answer to the Judaism instead of things trying to bring around instead of trying to bring the Messiah into existence through good works, they do it through bad works. They do it through sin. in fact, I think there was a book called The Holiness of Sin or something like that. Whereas they're trying to bring in the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, through sinful practices. So I can see how somebody or a group of people might be so, I guess, spiritually immature, right? Or have low spiritual IQ, and that they would fall for something like that. Now, for me, it seems kind of like counterproductive. It goes against everything that I feel. If you want to be a good person, you wake up in the morning, you have a bit of gratitude for the things in your life, and I keep things very simple. I have cold showers. I try to exercise. I try to be good to the people that I meet. I don't see how sin is going to bring me any closer to God.
Funny enough, I just made this point in the podcast, Jobcast I put up today. Exactly that. Like, what is it with these guys? We were specifically talking about Sabbateans, that they really are so inflated that they think that they can save the world, whatever their method is. But to have that kind of high an aspiration, uh, while for most of us it's hard enough just to live, to get through the day in a way that we have done more good than harm, let's say, or just trying to keep it simple here, but exactly the point you were making, to be as wholesome and as healthy and as oriented towards personal individual goodness in our lives, that's incredibly hard, maybe
Mm.
largely because of groups like this who have engineered us and, psychologically infiltrated us. But anyway, the point I wanted to make was that today, I mean, was that I think that the impulse or the drive or the agenda to try and shape society or save the world and make the world a better place is that's the ideology of today. That's the wokest ideology. That's their slogan. Not that it's confined to wokeism, which is just an easy term perhaps, but general progressivism in its many forms. It seems to have got crunched down in 2024 in the last decade or so to make the world a better place, and that's how you know that you're a good person if your purpose is to make the world a better place. But I think this trickles down from groups like this. I think they're all driven by some desire to make the world a better place, and that in itself is both deranging and a symptom of being deranged. Now I can't say that for sure because um, my cat is making a lot of noise there. Uh,
I've got one too. I've
it's
got
very
one too.
distracting. Uh, um, what's I saying?
You're
There's
just
a case in point, like could I control my cat? I can't. I mean, I'd have to, right? These people they want to control everything. So it is very hard to bring it back to your initial point. It's very, very difficult to understand, much less describe and explain the kind of agendas, methodologies, groups, the conspiracy theory, to use a blanket term, or conspiratorial analysis of society and of history attempts. I would say it's practically impossible, and it does almost invariably end up with what you're pointing out. It gets oversimplified, it gets crunched down to the Rothschilds are Satanists and they're ruling the world. And so it becomes fictional. It seems fictional because essentially it is fictional because if you describe a house as a box with holes in it, basically fiction. It doesn't. That's not what a house is. It's accurate, but it doesn't really help you, right, to build a house. So it's like that. It's like that. You simplify something and it becomes meaningless.
Do you think that do you think that, for example, people that are the elites, of course, they're capable of good works. Of course, they're capable of loving their family and caring for their loved ones. But where do you see the disconnect? Like when they look at us, the sheeple, and when they look at us, the populace, like where do you see this disconnect? How can they rationalize doing some of the things, right? Do they just see it as doing them for the greater good, i.e., bringing in, instigating the Messiah, the Messianic age? Do you think that's their end point, or are they even capable of that kind of foresight?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably too much foresight in a way, but it's like not being able to see the forest for the trees, or the other way around, maybe not being able to see the trees for the forest. Because if you're trying to think too far ahead or extremely far ahead, then I mean, this is, for example, Bertrand Russell, who was somebody that my grandfather kind of knew, because I grew up in a Fabian family. I didn't know at the time. And so I looked into Bertrand Russell because of that connection to my family. And I found out, really, to my own satisfaction, that Bertrand Russell, about when he was acting like a humanitarian, and when he was writing seemingly cautionary essays and books about a technological society and how inhumane it was going to be, that wasn't really the case. He was actually prescribing this kind of society as necessary, and the way that he squared that circle or resolved that contradiction of, a humanitarian who's trying to look out for all of humanity in the long run, who's prescribing inhumane policies and social arrangements, it's literally there in the text. He's saying we have to have several hundred years of absolute tyranny to completely strip human beings of all autonomy, all freedom of thought, of anything, in order to then, once we've gone through all that, then we can it's like training a dog, then we can take the leashes off and people can run around and be free again. Something like that. I'm obviously paraphrasing. He was a very highly intellectual guy. But point being that if you think that far ahead and you've got this rationale of an end that will justify the means, or in general, if you believe that ends justify means, then if your end is sufficiently ambitious, but also supposedly transcendentally important, then bets are all off. Like all means are justified if you believe your end is the salvation of the human race, or something else, or salvation of the human soul, say, and so on. Right? So that's
It's
how,
mhm.
yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, it seems so like it's for me. It just seems so silly. It seems so immature on a spiritual level. Like these are like you mentioned Bertrand Russell, and he's obviously a genius, and I know he's capable of goodness. I listened to one of his talks once, or one of his interviews, and he was basically saying about Bernard Shaw, right? Addressing some of Bernard Shaw's shortcomings, where I forget the exact thing, but some woman wrote to Bernard Shaw shortly after her husband died, and Shaw responded with, "Well, he was better off without you," or something like that. I forget the exact antidote, but so Bertrand Russell, he's capable of exhibiting goodness, right? Morality. So for him to have this oversight, it just seems so, where the ends justify the means, or excuse me, where the means justify the ends. It just seems
No,
so.
it is the end justify the means. I think the other way around is better, actually. I think the means need to justify the end, personally, because I think we need to stay focused on what we can see right in the moment are the results of our action, or feel empathically. Otherwise, it's mission creep. Um, so, uh, well, one point you made that he was capable of goodness, perhaps, or you mentioned George Bernard Shaw. Well, he was actually one of the founding Fabians. So it's timely to drop his name, and their emblem is the wolf in sheep's clothing. which is quite transparent of them to actually have that on their coat of arms and say, yeah, look, we're wearing sheep's clothing, but at least we're telling you we're wearing sheep's clothing. So, but in that metaphor, the goodness is really just a means to an end in itself, right? It's an assumption of goodness without actually being genuinely good. And yet it's very confusing because these individuals, as far as I can tell, and of course I can base it somewhat on growing up in a family that had those values, but I think we all can refer to our own experience. I mean, we have to, but I think all of us have some experience we can refer to around this. Um, I lost my point because I made so many uh, parentheses there. Something about
You were talking about Shaw,
goodness.
Bernard Shaw,
Yeah,
and
well,
the.
the
Mhm.
oh yeah, it's confusing because on the one hand, they seem to be using goodness as a ruse for evil ends, but on the other hand, what we think of as evil ends, they genuinely think of as good, I think, I assume. I mean, I just can't imagine that anybody, and talking about spiritual immaturity, anyone is actually like a comic book villain that cackles and rubs their hands together. Ha ha, I'm going to, you know,
Yeah.
commit more dastardly deeds today and get away with it. It seems,
That's what I mean. That's the cartoonish version of it. I just find hard to believe, let's say I'm sitting down and I'm having a coffee with one of my mates, and maybe, there's a very small percentage of my mates that'll be talking about this, but the one or two that does is they've got this kind of like, there's no in between, right? It's either you have this cartoon version of the Mr. Burns kind of figure from The Simpsons, rubbing his hands together, as you said, thinking of evil acts. And then you have the other side of it where it's just a big conspiracy to be laughed at. So there's no in between that kind of
no, well,
motto.
I mean, there is, but there's by no means enough, and it's a huge area.
Hmm.
I mean, this is a very basic thing I was aware of from very early on with somebody like David Icke, who I always cite, but just because he's easy to go to, like if you join the dots and you only have 5% of the dots, what kind of image are you going to come up with? Because there's 95% of these other dots that presumably a lot of them are come between the dots that you're joining. So you have a straight line there, but actually with all these other dots, there's nothing like a straight line. So it's back to that house analogy. You create a picture that is completely distorted. It's closer to reality than if you're not using any of the dots, or if you're only using the dots that have been provided by well, the very forces that you would be trying to expose with the dot joining, if you see what I mean. So you got the official version, which is haha conspiracy theory. That means you're a crackpot or an extremist domestic terrorist. In today's climate, they've upped the ante now. Conspiracy theorist isn't just someone to laugh at. He or she is somebody to fear. Um, but of course, I say of course, perhaps you're aware that the very term conspiracy theory was seeded by the CIA. I feel like I have to put it in quotes because it was probably more complex than that, but it can be traced, documented. There are documented evidence that the CIA were directly involved in seeding that term and making it associated with things, narratives they wanted to
What
marginalize.
what
Right?
do they which narrative did they try to first associate it with?
JFK with the
Okay, okay.
JFK assassination, yeah. So as an example, yeah. So we're being corralled. I mean, schismogenesis is the term I got from Gregory Bateson, who was OSS anthropologist, weaponized anthropology. He wasn't just doing about what schismogenesis is; he was doing about how to apply it for social engineering. But anyway, as a principle, it's very useful as a
Hmm.
lens for looking at, as you say, either you end up completely buying into an oversimplified conspiratainment version of history, or you huddle back with the masses who are saying, no, we can trust Big Pharma and Bill Gates, right? It's all nonsense. Not that it's literally that extreme. Obviously, everybody's got some sort of individual take on it. But we do tend to gravitate like planetary bodies towards a collective consensus, one way or another. It's very difficult. This is what my Substack's all about. I call it a place where cognitive dissidents can gather, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but as in a herd of cats. But so to stay in the cognitive dissidence of not ascribing to any official or unofficial narrative, any narrative. And you create your own narratives, but if you know that you're creating your own narrative, you know it's disposable, it's incomplete. You know that. Of course you do, because you're creating it, right? You can't really forget that. You can forget it if you repeat it long enough and you get a career convincing other people. But in the process of generating your own narrative to try and make sense of the facts, join the dots you have, you're aware it's just me. And that's a very difficult place to stay in. But it's the only place I think that we're really safe from being tricked.
When you say it's just me, so how does that translate for you? You live in Spain now, like myself. I guess you've been around the block a few times. How does that translate for you, Jason? Like, how do you live your daily? How do you maintain spiritual hygiene?
Yeah, that's an interesting term. That's one I've used in the past, or energetic hygiene. Yeah, well, it's a good question, particularly currently because I'm so stuck into creative stuff online and this film I'm making in London. Uh, I would say my energetic hygiene is suffering a bit because to me the key to energetic or spiritual hygiene is matter, is engaging with matter, with physical reality, which virtual technology really prevents, is designed to prevent. So, but it's not either or. So, um, yeah, I mean, a large part of it is uh, being outside, walking in nature. We have goats, spending time with goats. Uh, uh, the work that I have to do, or that I do anyway, a lot of time, just not recently, which is to do with house renovations or roofing or building carpentry, or we have a vineyard, digging posts, fences for these goats, and so on. There's usually as a principle, which I haven't maintained recently, it's 3 or 4 hours a day of that kind of work.
Mm.
Uh,
Do you,
and
I'm just curious, when you're doing manual work, do you listen to podcasts or are you just there in the silence with your own thoughts, or how do you go about that? Do you have a radio on in the background?
No, my wife does. She's always got a bloody MP3 player in her ear, which I object to, but fruitlessly or futilely. No, I mean, I occasionally, if I really have something that I need to listen to and I want to maximize the time, but as a general principle, I don't need to. To me, it's very mentally engaging to be weed whacking brambles. Well, it is. I mean, it's like a battle. I'm cursing, I'm swearing, I'm fighting the whole way through it, which isn't the healthiest way to proceed. But I'm not going to pretend that I'm more, Zen or Buddhist than I am. I'm an angry guy who gets frustrated when things don't go my way, and I don't care if anyone knows it, but I don't have to care because there's nobody around anyway. So. But the point was, yeah, it's also mentally stimulating to work the land, and people think there are tasks that are onerous, of course, like grouting, for example. It's hour after hour just filling cracks with mortar. Uh, but generally, even there, well, there I do listen to podcasts actually. But yeah, it is its own reward. And what I've noticed when I'm doing physical work often is that it's a curious phenomenon, but I notice that whatever's going on in my inner life or my social life, for lack of a better term, my human relations or my writing, but mostly the human interactions, I think, is where it comes up. It's like when you're remembering a dream during the day. I start to associate it with the work I'm doing. So if I'm killing brambles, and I've got some psychological problem or social problem, it gets imported into the act of killing the brambles or clearing the land, as if I were resolving that problem by doing this, which is not, I'm not consciously doing it. It's just that somehow the mental energy of this problem is getting superimposed onto the physical activity. And I do believe that's the principle. Like I've observed it from the early days of house
Can,
renovations.
can you elaborate a bit on that? And that's interesting. Can you go into that deeper when you say that the mental energy that do you mean like when you're engaged in that activity that you have more insights, that you get clearer insights?
Well,
Or
that's part of it. That would be the obvious way. But what's more subtle and more important is that I would say any problems we have, I'm going to say this now anyway, uh, psychological, emotional, and social, interactive, they're to do with blockages in the body. I'd say it all comes down to that, really, because if the body's clear of blockages, the soul, the psyche, the consciousness can just fully inhabit the body, and then we're in tune, we're in alignment with all of existence. So we just wouldn't have problems in the way that we tend to think of problems anyway. Obviously, there would be obstacles, but so so then to me, all of the physical activity is helping to clear out the body. And it's like mental problems are clusters of thought that get stuck or entangled in the nervous system, and the physical work actually is just physically a way to clear out blockages, just factually like a massage, but also it is a way to enact, it's like ritual, except it's not planned, to ritually enact the clearing out, or the untangling, or the resolving of what the problem is. And what I found is there actually are clear metaphorical correspondences for things. So I can't remember recently with the brambles, it was really obvious to me, but so I'll go back to an older one, which was when I was doing house renovations in Hope in Canada. um, my wife and I entered into that very consciously because we understood that buying an old crack house that was just full of, the debris of drug addicts and heroin needles and all, just exactly what you'd imagine, buying that and then doing the work necessary to get out all that toxic crap and rehabilitate the house and make it into a home, that would correspond precisely with the work that I knew I needed to do with my body, was clear out these toxins, clear out these negative imprints from my ancestral addictions and etc. etc. So we consciously, like, this is a way to ritualistically resolve, perform some healing, while at the same time, and that wasn't our motive, we wanted a house to live in. But I'm saying that's why we thought, yeah, let's take on this project. It's going to be really hard, but it will be worth it, not just because we'll get a good house to live in more cheaply, but also because it will correspond with a psychological process that it can't be addressed or resolved directly. It has to be done in a way that's indirect through learning to be in the body in new ways, essentially.
when you were in that house, I'm just curious. Lived in New York for a while, and I remember I took over an apartment once, and the apartment had belonged to a heroin addict, and the person OD'd. He died in the apartment, and I moved into it. Now, I was in active addiction myself at the time, so I didn't really have any. I didn't really feel any negative imprints, no, because there was so many negative stuff going on in my own life at the time. But when you were in Canada in that house, did you ever feel a heaviness? Did you ever feel like that you were, maybe it was more difficult to pray or meditate? Or
Uh, Not that latter, because that's not really my approach anyway. I mean, a big part of what I'm talking about for me actually is removing the extra layer of spiritual attention or spiritualization, and being aware of it. Like I said, I was aware that this is a process, but I wasn't thinking about it. And so because there was enough to think about just getting the house in order, same as with the brambles. So it's not like it's just that I notice, okay, something else is happening here. And I think it's enough for me to notice, but I don't want to put too much attention on it because that's the whole point, is that it has to happen at just below the threshold of consciousness or just on the threshold. So with that question in terms of the heavy energy, um, well, there were two things that came to mind. One is it was practical. I mean, ex-drug addicts or drug addicts rather, who used to come there to school, they would be knocking on our door for months after we moved in. So we were constantly being reminded of that energy, regardless of any sensitivity, right? But then on the other side of that spectrum, I did have dreams. I dreamt about how there were ghosts that had lived in that house and they'd had to go underground because the house had got too toxic even for the ghosts, and they were they were coming back. They were coming back into the house because of the clearing we'd done, and then of course I had to clear the ghosts as well. But yeah.
Do you pray, Jason? What's your spiritual practice? How do you connect to your higher power or God? How do you do that?
I don't know if I sort of got in a disagreement with my wife last night before sleep, which we often do, if she talks about the election and what's going on in America. I start getting annoyed. Um, but this was a more general disagreement, and I was saying, well, because she was saying that something about the divine and how we can have a connection to the divine and feel how much it enriches our lives, something like that, paraphrasing. And I was arguing that, yeah, that's true, but I don't think that's the ultimate reality. I think the ultimate reality is just the divine, and that's it. So it's like we're not even really present anymore because all there is the presence of the divine. And so there isn't a subject-object relationship. So although I'm aware that might be a bit of an excuse and that it might be helpful if I had a more kind of subject-object relationship with the higher power, as you put it, I actually don't. I
Okay.
don't. I'm at the stage in my life and have been for a few years now where I just pursue my own interests, but I just keep try and observe myself and check my motives and check in. I could say, and to keep it simple, like check in with my soul with the trust that my soul is already with God, because
Mhm.
somehow that's my understanding is that the soul is always with God, and but we or our awareness gets uncoupled from the soul and therefore from our body as well, and then we get trapped by these satanic forces. And so
Mhm.
I'm still working in my mind, and I know I'm still being manipulated by satanic forces, absolutely. So it'd be, very foolish to think I wasn't. But this sort of trust that my soul is with God, and as long as I keep checking in, and that I trust that my soul, the soul, because I belong to it, I suppose, in this kind of poetic language, it's going to let me know, even if it's like a kind of punishing energy, it's going to let me know if I stray too far. So, I mean, the body is to me, that's the best barometer. If my body feels good and if I'm more or less uh, in the flow of things, then, but also not just the body, but also what's going on outside as well.
Mhm.
Uh,
I can hear a bird in your background. I was just thinking.
oh
I was
well,
just yeah.
that of course. So yeah,
Mhm.
with the goats and all the natural things, but also in the world. I mean, to me, like the world that is an adversarial arrangement. It's the Satan is the prince of this world and all that. It's there also for a purpose to keep us on a line to God. As in, if we get out of line uh, in that way, then Satan, in quotes or without quotes, as you prefer, is there to knock us back into shape. So to me, it's all potentially an ally. Just
What do you think of Satan's role in the Book of Job? I know you write about Book of Job. What do you think it was? What do you think of it now? It's been a number of years since I read the Book of Job, but I still remember it clearly enough, I guess. What do you think of Satan's role in that particular book?
because we're back. We're quite close to sabotage Zavi and this weird transgressive philosophy. It says, well, let's serve God by doing Satan's work, which is Aleister Crowley's thing as well. And I've looked a lot more into Aleister Crowley than Zavi. I haven't looked into Zavi at all, so I can't comment. But Crowley seemed to have a similar principle, which is he wanted to embody the beast, 666, somehow with the rationale that the beast is part, like Judas in the New Testament, the beast is part of the revelation. So without the beast, there could be no apocalypse, there could be no second coming of Christ, and so on. So Crowley's like, well, I'll be the beast then, right? It's a good role, can't be the savior, but I'll be the other guy. I mean, something like that. I think that's in all of us actually. If we can't be the hero, we want to be the villain. We want to be one of the main characters really in this epic story. So what was the response to? I forgot you were
I
asking.
know. Well,
Satan's role in the book of Job.
you answered it. You answered it there quite good in a way. But I was kind of thinking of, the Satan or Satan's role in Job. It's almost like he's sent on a divine mission. Like it's almost he almost takes on this divine mission to tempt Job and to see if he'll curse God. So in a way, in a weird sense, Satan is an agent of God in that sense. It goes back to the Old Testament belief that, evil was created by God. God created, like there's actually a quote in the Old Testament. I don't know, don't ask me where exactly, but the quote is, I created evil. And it was God who was saying this.
Well, it
So
might
there,
even be in the book of Job. Certainly in the book of Job, Job says, should we accept good that comes from God and not evil? But I think it is, certainly that is consistent with the message of the book of Job, which is quite different from the rest of the Old Testament in a number of different ways, including that Job isn't, there's nothing ostensibly Jewish or Hebraic about Job. So it seems as though it predates the Abrahamic law and stuff.
I think it's the oldest book in the Old Testament, actually.
Well, it's not official, but
Hmm.
there is some consensus on that. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, but so this idea, it's a very subtle one.
Hmm.
That Satan is working for God. It's one I've never not held, let's say. I've always, because to me, the alternative is schizophrenia, not in a good way. It's to be split or divided because it doesn't make sense. It only makes sense. It doesn't quite make sense if, Satan's just working for God and it's all kind of an act. It's like cosmic theater. It doesn't quite make sense, but it makes more sense than that there's actually this split and Satan is working against God and God's trying to get rid of Satan or something. There's no way that Satan could be doing what he's doing if God wasn't allowing it. In the book of Job, I mean, in the theology, in a theological view, in the book of Job, it's official. It's right there in black and white. Satan says, "Well, I don't think he's that good. Let me have at him," and God says, "Okay." So it's implied that Satan couldn't do anything without God's okay. But
Hmm.
either way, certainly God knew it. God did, endorse it. So then, yeah, the question is why? Why? Why did Job need testing? Well, why does any of it? Why not? Is the answer to that, or how not? How could it not be a test or existence? I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense, really.
Hmm.
Otherwise, if we were all just, this is actually in Steiner, it's an interesting model that I've used in Seen and Not Seen, the idea that initially we could see, like before the fall in the Garden of Eden, we could see the workings of the gods with our senses, perceive them. And so we absolutely had no choice about going along with them because you can see, it's like if you could see absolutely the consequences of your every action, you would make sure that you acted rightly in order to have the desirable consequences. It's kind of like that. And
Hmm.
then Lucifer came along and said, no, these beings should be free, God. So I'm going to blind them. I'm going to blind their spiritual senses so they can't see the plan of God or the workings of spiritual reality. And that way they have to uh, make choices that can be right or wrong. And so they will learn. And as a compensation for taking away the sight, and this is in Steiner's version, Lucifer gave man imagination, which is like Promethean fire, which is the
Hmm.
power to imagine realities. And that's the test, as I see it. Like, do we use our imagination to imagine this reality and so get back to reality, or do we use our imagination to imagine reality that is not real, imagine false reality, and so get further and further from reality? That feels like to me where we're at.
It's so easy to get enmeshed in the world, in materialism and in the physical world, and to see it as almost reality and nothing more, right? That there's nothing beyond that. And you're talking about the imagination there. And a poet I like is William Blake, and he talked a lot about the imagination. Do you what? I know you like Blake as well. How do you see Blake informing our view of reality? How do you see his idea of the imagination informing the way we think, the way we feel?
Well, I'm on the fence about Blake. I mean, I quoted him in this last piece, but specifically around the Jews. And it's interesting to me because I quoted the thing about Blake saying that all nations will become subject to the Jews in this subtle way, uh, 10, 20 years ago, because I just thought, oh, well, that's the key there. And it still hasn't been. I've never heard anyone else refer to what Blake said about nations becoming subject to the Jews ever. And yet it's such a key piece of or interpretation or a key lens to look at this growing meme of the Jews control everything, which, needless to say, I think is absurdly
But
simple,
did he
simplistic.
did he mean that in actual physical sense, or in a more in an imaginative sense, like the New Jerusalem? Just did he mean actually that we will come into line with the actual Jews that are living now in Israel, for
Well,
example?
no, I don't suppose he did, but I think it's implied that uh, well, I don't know if it's implied, but he's implying a subtler level of subjugation. Um, as in, if we collectively or many different nations who aren't populated by ethnical Jews, nor are they um, practicing Judaism, if nonetheless they worship the Jewish God Yahweh, which is to say, any Christian nation is worshipping the Jewish God Yahweh, really, I see.
Hmm.
Their
Hmm.
Bible's got the Old Testament in there. Then they're subject to, and we can see this in something like Christian Zionism and beyond, because the idea that the Jews were and still are the chosen people is fairly popular among Christians, let's say.
Hmm.
So there is a continuum there. But anyway, the subtler point is, and the point I make is perhaps even subtler, or at least equally subtle in this recent post, is to do with the Jewish alphabet Hebrew and being so right there, the operating system of Western culture, let's say, if we say that it's the Semitic languages and specifically Hebrew, and certainly it's the operating system of Western occultism, then what kind of control does that give? But then it's difficult to finish that sentence. Like, to who exactly? Is it to Yahweh? Is it to some chosen people who are still around because they lived for thousands of years? Is it to some group that just keeps back? Anyway, that's all. Let's put that aside because your question was about Blake and the imagination. So Blake wrote that the imagination, I forget the exact quote, but it was something like essentially that the imagination is the realm of reality.
Mm-hmm.
That we can enter into the realm of the imagination, and that will be reality, which is what I'm saying, that potentially that could be true, but not because we can create reality with the imagination, but because the imagination is a God or a Lucifer given gift that potentially can be used to remember or find our way back to ultimate reality. I'm on the fence about Blake because I don't know where his allegiance was. Like he was quite Gnostic.
Yeah,
Uh,
for I think when he was like criticizing this reality, the materialism, the physical world, he would draw on figures like Newton, and accuse Newton of being blind by the mechanics of the universe instead of being more expansive in the way he was imagining it.
yeah, sure. I mean, I've always enjoyed Blake, and he's been very formative. My skepticism now isn't so much based on things that I read it with new eyes. If I read Blake now, there might be things here and there that I'm like,
Did did you
that's
did
a
you ever
bit.
did you
Uh,
ever read C.K. Chesterton's book on Blake?
uh,
He wrote a book on Blake, Chesterton, and it was very good actually. But he was like, his whole premise in the book was Blake mad, and he comes to the conclusion that, at least I remember, it's been about 20 years since I read it, but at the end of it, he comes to the conclusion that yes, he was, but he was mad in a prophet in a he was a prophet, like he had the madness of a prophet.
right. Well, I like G.K. Chesterton. He seems like he's quite a down to earth kind of guy as compared to Blake. Um, but what I was going to say about Blake, I mean, because the madness of prophets isn't necessarily an endorsement either. I mean, just because it's prophetic madness still doesn't mean that you would want to trust this guy. I think not that's exactly about trust. But what I was going to say, what kind of is, was that uh, the big question I have, and this is with Jung, for example, also more so than with Blake, is how influential has Blake been? Because it seems he's been very influential, Blake. And so, how much does his thinking inform the culture that we currently live in, albeit, it's like Crowley's influence is more observable through the Beatles than it is through Crowley. So Blake's influence is more observable through Aldous Huxley, who named his most famous non-fiction book, right, The Doors of Perception,
Yeah.
after Blake, and so on. I mean, that's a good micro example. Can we trust Blake? Because we know we can't trust Aldous Huxley, and Aldous Huxley was inspired by Blake. It seems as though a lot of Blake was saying is consistent or was useful to agendas that are taking us into this transhumanist hell world. So is Blake accountable? And that's where I'm on the fence about Blake.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't quote him generally, as I'd hardly quote anyone as a source of wisdom, just as for specific, uh, something I can specifically use to make an argument.
In your Substack, Jason, you added a PDF, Rudolf Steiner and the Jews, that Judaism still exists is an era of history. Can you briefly go into that? I haven't had a chance to read that particular PDF. Can you give me a synopsis of that? I
Well,
intend to read it. I intend to read it later on. But what was
right.
he
Well,
getting at?
the PDF I linked to is actually by a Jewish author whose name I don't recall because I've never heard
Oh,
of
wait,
it.
no, I got it here.
Who's criticized?
Yeah, Israel Koran.
He's saying that Steiner was an anti-Semite, and that this is a common view now that anthroposophists not apologized. They've tried to explain away Steiner's views by saying this, that, and the other. Well, some of his best friends were Jews, or he said something else, etc. But generally speaking, his views are just seen as anti-Semitical. And that's the end of it, in our current culture. Basically, that if your views can be described as anti-Semitic, they must be wrong. This is a bit like the idea that uh, I was thinking of original fat people as an example I always use, but that you can't call somebody fat because it's shaming, and yet, or you can't imply that being fat is bad for the health because we're supposed to affirm people's identities. It's a bit like that because it's irrelevant. Like whether a set of views appear to be anti-Semitic is independent on whether they're accurate or not. This is really essential thing around anti-Semitism, as we're finding out now. If you criticize Israel's behavior in Gaza, you're anti-Semitic, or well, hello. I mean, nobody believes that. I don't think even the people who are trying to enforce that kind of thing. So it's become very obvious now that the term anti-Semitic is just being used to censor and control. In the case of Steiner, well. Sure, I mean, him saying that Judaism existing is a mistake of history or an error of history, it's very easy to see how that can be instantly framed as anti-Semitic. But is it true? I mean, that's what I'm looking at. It seems there's a pretty good case for that, even if you're not a Christian. I mean, you have to kind of have some this because this was Steiner's. Steiner, although he wasn't a Christian, he was an anthroposophist. I mean, he created his own movement. You could say he was a Christian. He was just a his own kind of Christian because he the being of Christ or the Christ as a reference point was absolutely central to anthroposophy. He said you can't get anthroposophy, you can't observe it, you can't even be a human being. He's saying, or you can't evolve spiritually without Christ being your number one principle. So that to me, that's Christianity. It's just not, right? It's nothing official. So from that point of view, that Judaism survived, not Christianity exactly, but Christ's mission, which was partly to replace Judaic law with Christly grace, the grace of Christ, or the Holy Spirit, perhaps we should say, direct contact with or direct service of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, what's going on? Why is Judaism saying no? That's just a branch of it's complicated anyway. There's all kinds of politics in it, but that's just to sum up Steiner's view. There's a lot more to it. But that's the element that interested me. It was specific around Judaism. It wasn't about this point about ethnic Jews was, well, if Judaism is no longer relevant or healthy or benign as a system of worship, then why I didn't actually say this, but why continue to identify as Jewish?
Did you read Steiner's book on Nietzsche?
No, I haven't read the book. I've heard some of his comments on Nietzsche, yeah.
What did you think of Nietzsche's view? I know you quote in your Substack. You said you revert to a Substack, the complicated relationship between the central bank owners and the Jewish people, and I know they mention that article mentions Nietzsche. What was Nietzsche's grasp or view on this?
Well, actually, I wasn't that familiar until I read some of that Substack neoliberal feudalism Substack
I think it
articles.
goes into genealogy of morals, how they flipped everything around.
Yeah, well, I think because I didn't notice that Nietzsche viewed the Jewish people as having the most developed will to power. So he did admire them on the one hand, and he professed to despise anti-Semitism. But that was not to say that he was actually advocating, certainly not Judaism or anything like that. What was the context again for this?
No, just that what was his whole well, you know how there was a bad and a good, and it suddenly turned to evil and good in his genealogy of morals, and he was kind of implying that the Christians, right, that they flipped morality on its head, where something stopped being noble and it became bad, right? You had to be meek, you had to be humble.
Sure, yeah.
So he was coming from
Yeah,
that's
so Nietzsche's allegiance, as far as I can understand, was more to a Roman or a Hellenistic, not that they're synonymous, but Greek, Roman, this kind of pre-Christian and independent of Judaism values that had, yeah, much more to do with heroic values, nobility, and to do with force and strength, and these qualities that Hitler was famously also advocating. Um,
Mhm.
so with Christianity, yeah, although apparently Nietzsche did say something that I retweeted because I agree with it, that Christ was the only
True
Christ.
Christian, yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so it's hard to argue with Nietzsche some of these basic points that
Hmm.
after Jesus, Yeshua, Christianity, I mean, it went wrong. I mean, it never really. It was wrong from the start. And there's at least two historical arguments for this. One is really obvious. Well, the Romans adopted Christianity long before we were around, so whatever we're getting has been filtered through the Roman Empire that actually crucified Christ. And the second is very similar, really, which is that Judaism, this is more new to me, but that Judaism or certain rabbis or certain powerful Jews at the time were very intentionally um, determined to uh, co-opt Christianity in order to weaken the Roman Empire. This is a new theory to me. But obviously, the first Christians were Jews, and I mean, religious Jews. They were practicing Judaism until Jesus came along. And so part of this theory of the history of Christianity is that they were double agents.
Hmm.
Uh, and then again, well, the high priests of Judaism were also the ones calling for Jeshua's death in the gospel. So then that's similar again. Well, to what extent was Christ's message co-opted either by these double agents or infiltrants among his apostles and or guys who just didn't get it, or by the enemies of Christ?
Hmm. Well, Jason, it's been a great interview. I really enjoyed listening to you, and you've got a lot of great insights. I got a lot out of listening to you today. I'm now I came across one of your I was after I subsequently was looking into some of your stuff, and I saw a book that I intend to get. It's 16 Maps of Hell. Can you go into that a bit? What without giving it away, just what's the gist of that?
Well, there's no spoilers in non-fiction, I don't think. At least not mine. I can't really, since we're using video. I've got three hardbacks left. It was a self-published or crowdfunded thing, and back in 2020, and I think there were 400 copies in the end. It was actually my most successful book in that regard. I mean, financially. Uh,
Wow.
and it is a examination of my lifelong addiction, let's say, which is to Hollywood, to movies, to entertainment media, an attempt to use it as a lens to which to look at the ways in which we've been colonized and infiltrated by these secret societies, if you will,
Hmm.
conspiracies, these organizations and these ideologies and these agendas. Funny enough, I don't talk about the Jews in quotes, at all in 60 Maps of Hell. And you would think, I mean, I'm sure the word is there, but you would think an examination of the deeper uh, covert and occult agendas behind Hollywood media, you would think there would be some mention of, well, actually, this mostly was created and run by Jewish people, but I just wasn't really interested back then in kind of singling out a particular type there. So it's more about um, just the overarching or underlying methodologies using a series of examples, hence these 16 maps, the 16 chapters, and
Hmm.
it's well, it has a very broad reach, really,
Hmm.
um, of
I
material. Yeah.
I most certainly intend to get that, and maybe we can do another interview after I go through that. I'm just curious as well. You have a lot of books there behind you. If you could have a conversation with one fictional character, who would it be and why?
Fictional, huh? That
If
would be
you it,
it would be risky if it was fictional because I might end up like Woody Allen trapped in a novel. I've not thought about that. Fictional. Um, gosh. Oh, I suppose it would have to be Raskolnikov, really, because I feel that I've
okay,
got
good,
a lot
yeah.
in common with Raskolnikov.
What would you ask him? What would the conversation involve? What's your favorite Dostoevsky novel?
It
Like
has to be Crime and Punishment, I'm afraid, because I've read that one many, many times, and the others don't quite stand up to the
the
same degree.
the Eternal Husband. Have you read that?
I have, yeah, but
No.
it was almost an unfinished novel, but certainly it wasn't. There's a reason why it's not among his classics, because
Mm.
he was quite undisciplined as a writer, I think, but that's also how he was able to get such amazing things out. What I would ask Raskolnikov, I'd ask him, like in the first scene in Blade Runner, I'd ask him to tell me about his mother, because I think that that's underlying. That's why he kills the pawnbroker and why he ends up accidentally killing her daughter because he resents his mother and his sister so much.
Really, I can't recall him. Does he say that in the novel, or are you implying that just by his dialogue or
Yeah, no,
language?
it's implied, as it's been implied by
Okay.
Dostoevsky, because Raskolnikov feels oppressed by the fact that his sister is going to marry this man for money, and Raskolnikov, has no money, and so this fuels his resentment around towards the old woman
Hmm.
who has the money, and he creates this cover story like the Napoleon complex, the superior men should be able to kill. We're back to this original topic that we started with, really. The superior man should be able to kill the inferior man in order to achieve his goals. He comes up with this Nietzschean philosophy to cover up the fact that he feels just miserable and oppressed by his own poverty, but also that because of becoming more conscious what his sister is going to do, that he feels trapped by his family and by his mother and his sister's view of him, that they put all this hope into him, that he's the son who's going to make it good, and that they don't really know him. They don't really know what he's like. And so that oppresses him to the point that although he can't directly strike against them, he does something that will alienate them for forever, really.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, Jason, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you get your jobs done in your house today. What are the jobs you're going at today with it?
Well, as I said, I'm so busy with these two projects that I haven't been doing more than just the token uh, tour around the land and visiting the goats. We've got a goatling, so that's a very fun job, which isn't a job at all, which is just to spend time with the baby goat so that it gets accustomed to having people around. That's delightful. Uh, yeah, no, I actually don't have anything ongoing right now, but we do have a little stone house that we're renovating or getting ready for guests, hopefully by June. Maybe I should also mention that I'm doing this event in Porto, in Portugal in June. Might
Hmm.
interest you.
Please tell us where we can find your stuff and what you've got coming up. By all means, please.
Yeah, well, so this event is called the Community of Free Spirits. It's a 2-day event in Porto that I'll be speaking at. Luke Dodson and Adam and Orms and a few other people will be there. And I mention it because I'm hoping to get things ready on my land to have a little gathering here after that, because we have enough land to do gatherings and stuff. Maybe even taking refugees when, the Bill Gates mosquitoes are unleashed on the whole population, what have you. As far as virtually speaking, it's really all that all the action is at the Children of Job Substack. Hopefully, it will still be there by the time this airs. I noticed the Substack went down yesterday for a couple of hours, and my wife said, "Well, they are getting some flack, Substack, because you know they have a policy of not censoring anyone. And of course, a lot of writers, such as myself, are actually able to make it something like a living at Substack, which is new. It's a new phenomenon. So I believe that there's some high power resentment about Substack. It might, it might not last that. You know, we're in these very shaky times. There's a lot, you know, a lot invested in making sure that the narratives they want to deliver get delivered, and people like you or I might be interfering with that signal. But anyway, in the meantime, that's where I'm at, childrenofjob@substack.com. My main site is landmademan.com. That's just a landing pad, really. I haven't done anything there for ages. But at Children of Job, I'm doing these weekly essays currently on an alternate view of World War II and what went on there. Very risky. And weekly Jobcast, talking to people.
So again, Jason, thank you so much.
Sure, yeah, well, thanks, Michael. I'm glad we met. We're neighbors, so it's encouraging if I can meet people actually in the area, roughly.
100%, 100%. Thank you so
Okay.
much.